The mind is both a powerful tool and a dangerous trap. It can build a life of clarity, strength, and purpose, or it can imprison you in cycles of fear, doubt, and illusion. Most people assume they are in control of their thoughts, yet they rarely question them. They assume that what they feel is real, that what they think is true, that the narratives in their mind reflect reality. But what if they don't? What if the greatest obstacle in your life isn't the world around you, but the way your own mind interprets it? Philosophers, psychologists, and thinkers throughout history have recognized this paradox, the idea that the very thing designed to guide us can often mislead us. Marcus Aurelius warned against believing every thought that arises, reminding himself that the mind, left unchecked, is prone to exaggeration and distortion. Epictetus taught that suffering is not caused by events, but by the interpretations we attach to them. Modern neuroscience confirms this, revealing how deeply our thoughts are shaped by habits, past experiences, and unconscious biases, often leading us to act against our own best interests. Your mind is not a passive observer. It is an active force that constantly shapes your reality. If you do not learn to master it, it will master you. This episode is about reclaiming that control, about recognizing the illusions, breaking the cycles, and reshaping the way you think before your thoughts shape you. The battle for a stronger, clearer mind is not fought in a single moment, but in small, daily decisions to question, to reframe, and to direct your mental energy toward what truly matters. So, the question is, who is in charge, you or the voice in your head? Your mind lies to you more than you think. The mind is a storyteller, but not always an honest one. It takes fragments of reality and fills in the gaps with assumptions, fears, and distorted narratives. It convinces you that worst-case scenarios are inevitable, that past failures define future outcomes, and that your emotions are accurate reflections of the truth. But if you never question these thoughts, they become the lens through which you see the world, one shaped not by reality, but by perception. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He reminded himself that external events hold no power over the mind. Only our interpretation of them does. He saw that thoughts, left unexamined, create unnecessary suffering. A setback becomes a catastrophe. A delay turns into failure. A single criticism morphs into self-doubt. Yet, none of these conclusions exist outside the mind. They are merely stories the brain tells, often without evidence, reinforcing patterns of fear and limitation. Seneca observed that people suffer more in imagination than in reality. He recognized how the mind amplifies uncertainties, replaying past mistakes and projecting them onto the future as if they were destined to repeat. But he also understood that thoughts are not commands, they are suggestions. A person who takes every passing thought as truth lives in a world of constant anxiety, shaped by fears that have no grounding in reality. The only way to break free is to recognize that the mind is not always an ally. Sometimes it is the very thing holding you back. Modern psychology confirms what the Stoics intuited centuries ago. Cognitive distortions, patterns of thinking that exaggerate fear, reinforce negativity, or predict failure, are among the greatest sources of self-imposed suffering. The mind misinterprets uncertainty as danger, assumes that temporary setbacks are permanent, and creates narratives that keep people trapped in cycles of hesitation and doubt. But these thoughts are not reality. They are mental habits, and like any habit, they can be changed. The first step toward mental mastery is to stop assuming that every thought is true. Not every fear deserves attention. Not every doubt reflects reality. Learning to question the mind, to step back and observe thoughts before accepting them, is the foundation of clarity. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The moment you recognize that your thoughts are often just stories, not facts, you begin to take back control. You stop living in the illusions your mind creates and start engaging with reality as it is, not as fear or doubt would have you believe. Your thoughts are on autopilot. Break the cycle. Imagine waking up in a house where every room looks the same. Every hallway leads back to where you started, and no matter how far you walk, you find yourself trapped in the same loop. This is how most people experience their own minds, moving in circles, thinking the same thoughts, feeling the same doubts, carrying the same fears day after day. If the brain is left unchallenged, it does not innovate, it repeats. The cycle is so subtle that it feels natural, but in reality, it's a form of self-imposed limitation, one that most never escape. The mind prefers familiarity. It clings to known patterns, even when they no longer serve us. A person who has lived with self-doubt for years does not question it. They simply accept it as part of who they are. Someone who constantly worries about failure may not realize that their fear is not based on reality, but on old experiences that no longer apply. The brain doesn't distinguish between thoughts that are useful and those that are harmful. It simply reinforces whatever it is given most often. If a certain belief is repeated enough times, it becomes truth in the mind, regardless of whether it reflects reality. This is why breaking the cycle is so difficult. It's not just about changing thoughts. It's about confronting a deeply ingrained system, one that has shaped your actions, decisions, and even your identity. Most people don't actively choose to think the way they do. They are simply running on old programming, reacting to life rather than deliberately shaping it. To interrupt this pattern, awareness is not enough. Action is required. One of the most powerful ways to disrupt mental autopilot is through exposure to the unfamiliar. This doesn't necessarily mean grand, life-changing experiences. It can be as simple as reading something that challenges your perspective, engaging in conversations that force you to think differently, or deliberately doing something that contradicts an old belief. The goal is not to erase the past, but to introduce enough new information that the mind is forced to adapt. The difference between those who remain stuck in their mental loops and those who evolve is not intelligence, it is intention. Some people assume their thoughts are fixed, that their reactions are natural, that they just are the way they are. Others recognize that the mind is adaptable, that thought patterns are habits rather than truths, and that with enough effort they can rewire the way they think. The challenge is this: will you continue walking the same mental pathways, reliving the same doubts, reinforcing the same fears, or will you disrupt the cycle, rewrite the narrative, and take back control? The brain will continue running its patterns, but you have the ability to change them. The real question is, will you? The battle in your mind. Who's in charge? Inside every person, there is an ongoing battle, one that is rarely acknowledged, yet constantly waged. It is not a war fought with weapons or words, but with thoughts. Two opposing forces exist within the mind, one that drives you forward, and one that holds you back. One voice speaks of possibilities, resilience and strength. The other whispers fear, doubt, and hesitation. Every decision, every moment of self-reflection is a battle between these two forces. The question is not whether they exist, It is which one you allow to lead. For many, the voice of doubt is louder, more persistent. It thrives on hesitation, finding reasons to postpone action, to avoid risk, to cling to comfort. It tells you that you are not ready, that failure is inevitable, that you are not enough. This voice does not come from truth, but from repetition. It is the echo of past fears, reinforced over time until it feels like reality. And yet, there is another voice, quieter, but always present. It is the voice that urges you to step forward, to embrace discomfort as growth, to trust in your own ability to adapt. It does not guarantee success, but it reminds you that stagnation is a far greater failure than trying and falling short. This internal conflict is universal. Even the most disciplined, accomplished individuals are not free from it. The difference is not that they have silenced doubt, but that they have trained themselves to listen to the voice that moves them forward. They have learned that the mind, if left unchecked, defaults to fear. It looks for the safest route, the most familiar path, the option with the least resistance. But safety is not progress, and comfort is not fulfillment. Those who achieve mastery over their minds do not eliminate fear. They simply refuse to let it dictate their actions. Psychologists describe this inner dialogue as a battle between the rational and emotional mind. The rational mind is deliberate, analytical, and measured. It seeks logic, clarity, and long-term growth. The emotional mind, however, is reactive, instinctual, and focused on immediate comfort. Both serve a purpose. Fear can be a necessary warning. Caution can be a form of wisdom. But when left unchecked, the emotional mind overpowers reason, making choices based on temporary feelings rather than long-term value. Learning to recognize this pattern is the first step in reclaiming control. In ancient philosophy, this concept was often discussed in terms of self-mastery. The Stoics believed that the ability to govern one's own mind was the highest form of freedom. They did not seek to suppress emotion, but to guide it, to ensure that fear did not lead to paralysis, that doubt did not dictate identity. They saw self-discipline not as restriction, but as liberation. The ability to act in alignment with one's goals rather than one's impulses. This battle in the mind is not won in a single moment. It is a lifelong practice. It is the choice to act despite uncertainty, to challenge negative thoughts before accepting them, to recognize that fear and hesitation are suggestions, not commands. Every day you have the opportunity to strengthen one voice and weaken the other. Every action either reinforces the mindset of doubt or builds the habit of courage. The decision is never made once. It is made in 1,000 small moments, in the way you think, the way you respond, and the way you choose to move forward. So the question is not whether fear and doubt will speak. They will. The real question is, which voice will you listen to? Emotions are not reality. Stop letting them control you. Emotions feel absolute, undeniable. When fear strikes, it seems like danger is imminent. When anxiety rises, it feels as if failure is certain. When anger takes hold, it seems justified, unshakable. But emotions, powerful as they may be, are not reality. They are reactions, signals shaped by perception, past experiences, and unconscious biases. They demand attention, but they do not always tell the truth. Those who assume that every emotion is an accurate reflection of reality live at the mercy of their moods, reacting impulsively instead of responding intentionally. The mind is wired for survival, not objectivity. It generates emotional responses based on patterns, often prioritizing caution over clarity. A minor setback can trigger frustration not because it is catastrophic, but because the mind has learned to associate inconvenience with failure. A small rejection can create a sense of worthlessness, not because it defines one's value, but because past experiences have wired the brain to react that way. This is why untrained emotions become dangerous, not because they exist, but because they are followed without question. Machiavelli, though known for his political insight, understood this principle deeply. He saw that those who act purely on emotion, whether in leadership, negotiation, or personal life, often make decisions they later regret. He noted that power belongs to those who remain composed, those who do not allow temporary feelings to dictate lasting choices. The moment emotions dictate action without reason, control is lost. A person who reacts in anger rather than strategy, who makes decisions from fear rather than analysis, is predictable, and predictability makes one easy to manipulate. Modern psychology echoes this understanding, recognizing that emotional regulation is a cornerstone of both mental resilience and decision-making. Studies show that people who practice emotional awareness, who pause before reacting, who question their own feelings, tend to make better long-term choices. They do not suppress emotion, they interpret it. Fear is examined. Is this a real threat or just discomfort? Anxiety is challenged. Does this feeling reflect reality or just a habit of overthinking? Anger is held in check. Is this worth a reaction, or does patience serve me better? The difference between those who are controlled by their emotions and those who master them is the ability to pause, to reflect, and to choose their response rather than be consumed by impulse. The Stoics mastered this approach centuries ago, training themselves to separate emotion from action. Marcus Aurelius, facing relentless pressure as emperor, wrote reminders to himself that feelings are fleeting, that the mind must remain in command. He saw emotions as waves, powerful but temporary, never worth drowning in. Seneca advised stepping back from intense emotions, recognizing that what feels urgent in the moment often fades when given time. He believed that wisdom is found not in suppressing emotion, but in understanding its nature, seeing it for what it is, rather than what it appears to be. In daily life, this lesson is invaluable. How often do people make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions? How often is an opportunity rejected out of fear, a relationship damaged by anger, a dream abandoned because of self-doubt? When emotions go unexamined, they dictate choices, shaping life not based on reason, but on momentary reactions. The solution is not to eliminate emotions, but to master them, to create space between feeling and action, allowing the rational mind to take the lead. A person who learns to observe emotions rather than obey them gains a significant advantage. They are not easily provoked, not swayed by passing moods, not controlled by temporary fears. They develop the ability to act with clarity, to think beyond the present moment, to ensure that their decisions align with their long-term vision rather than their short-term feelings. Emotions will always arise. Fear, anxiety, frustration, they are part of being human. But they are not the final authority. They are information, not instructions. And the moment you recognize that, you begin to reclaim control, not by suppressing what you feel, but by ensuring that what you feel does not dictate who you become. Wasting mental energy. Focus only on what you control. Every day you wake up with a limited amount of mental energy. How you spend it determines everything: your productivity, your emotional stability, your sense of purpose. Yet most people drain their energy on things entirely beyond their control. worrying about the past, stressing over the opinions of others, fixating on what could go wrong. They exhaust themselves fighting battles that cannot be won, attempting to control what was never theirs to command. And, at the end of the day, they are left depleted, not because they worked hard toward meaningful goals, but because they spent their energy on distractions and illusions. The Stoics understood this better than anyone. They saw that the mind is constantly tempted to focus outward, to blame circumstances, to dwell on past failures, to fear an uncertain future. But Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that true strength comes from redirecting attention to what is within one's power. He could not control the chaos of politics, the betrayal of allies, or the course of fate itself, but he could control his own actions, his own thoughts, his own responses. He realized that peace is not found in changing the world, but in mastering the self. This idea is not just philosophical, it is practical. How much time is lost in unnecessary worry? How often do people replay past conversations, imagining what they could have said differently? How frequently do they let social media, news, or the opinions of strangers dictate their emotional state? The truth is, most people are exhausted not because they're doing too much, but because they're focusing on too many things they cannot influence. The brain, like a muscle, has limits. When mental energy is spent on uncontrollable factors, there is little left for what actually matters: growth, discipline, action. Machiavelli, though focused on power rather than inner peace, saw this same principle at play in leadership. He observed that rulers who wasted time worrying about the unpredictable, whether they were loved, whether circumstances would favor them, were often the weakest. In contrast, those who accepted uncertainty, who focused on controlling their own actions rather than fearing external forces, were the ones who thrived. Machiavelli understood that worrying about perception or reputation was meaningless unless one took action to shape it. He saw that energy spent on speculation was energy lost. Seneca took this idea a step further, warning that the greatest waste of life is spending it on things outside one's command. He wrote that people fear misfortune, yet misfortune is nothing but events unfolding as they will. They resent aging, yet time passes regardless of protest. They seek approval, yet the thoughts of others are beyond their reach. Seneca believed that freedom comes not from controlling the external world, but from refusing to let it dictate internal peace. He understood that true mastery begins with a simple but profound shift, letting go of what cannot be influenced and directing full effort toward what can. In modern life, this wisdom is more relevant than ever. The mind is constantly pulled in 1,000 directions: political debates, online arguments, comparisons to strangers on social media, worries about an economy that no individual can single-handedly change. People consume endless information, believing that knowing more will give them control, yet they only end up more anxious, more distracted, more powerless. The truth is, no matter how much energy is spent on external concerns, they remain outside of one's grasp. The Stoics remind us that real power lies in shifting focus inward, toward the things we can control: our actions, our discipline, our responses to life's uncertainties. The moment we stop trying to manage the uncontrollable and start directing our energy toward self-mastery, we reclaim a sense of purpose, clarity, and resilience. Marcus Aurelius found strength in this mindset, refusing to let the instability of the Roman Empire dictate his inner peace. Seneca practiced it by freeing himself from the expectations of others, focusing instead on cultivating his own wisdom. Their lesson is clear: wasted energy is wasted life. The choice is always ours. Either we allow external forces to scatter our attention, or we take full ownership of our thoughts and direct them where they truly matter. Your brain is a muscle. Train it or stay weak. The mind, like the body, requires discipline to grow stronger. Yet while people readily accept that physical strength demands exercise, few apply the same logic to mental strength. They assume intelligence is fixed, that discipline is a matter of willpower alone, that mental resilience is something some people are simply born with. But just as muscles deteriorate without use, so too does the mind. Without deliberate training, thoughts become sluggish, attention weakens, and emotions take control. The brain does not remain static. It either strengthens through effort or weakens through neglect. The Stoics understood this well. Marcus Aurelius trained his mind through daily reflection, writing reminders to himself to maintain perspective, to resist emotional impulses, to align his thoughts with reason rather than reaction. He saw that mental clarity is not something granted by nature, it is cultivated. Each time he questioned his assumptions, redirected his focus, or chose self-discipline over indulgence, he was strengthening his ability to govern himself. His private writings were not simply philosophical musings. They were exercises in mental conditioning, a way to ensure that his thoughts served him rather than controlled him. Seneca viewed intellectual training as essential for a life of wisdom. He believed that just as the body benefits from discomfort, lifting heavier weights, enduring resistance, testing its limits, the mind requires challenge to grow. He cautioned against a life of ease, knowing that without struggle, the mind becomes soft, incapable of handling adversity. He saw philosophy not as abstract theory, but as weightlifting for the intellect, a way to sharpen one's reasoning, fortify resilience, and prepare for the unpredictability of life. He urged his students to seek discomfort in thought, to ask difficult questions, to challenge their own beliefs, knowing that true wisdom is born from friction. Epictetus, whose early life was defined by hardship, believed that mental training was the foundation of all freedom. He observed that those who do not strengthen their minds are prisoners, not of external forces, but of their own undisciplined thoughts. He saw that most suffering comes not from circumstances, but from an inability to manage perception. To him, philosophy was not a luxury of the educated, but a necessity for anyone seeking mastery over themselves. He trained his students to question their automatic reactions, to resist the pull of anxiety and fear, to develop a mind capable of withstanding life's uncertainties. Modern science confirms what the Stoics understood centuries ago. The brain is highly adaptable, capable of rewiring itself through consistent effort. Studies on neuroplasticity show that mental habits, whether patterns of thought, emotional responses, or levels of focus, are strengthened with repetition. Those who engage in disciplined thinking, who challenge their assumptions, who practice mindfulness and intentional focus, develop a mind that is sharper, clearer, more resistant to distraction. Conversely, those who indulge in constant mental passivity, mindless consumption, habitual negativity, emotional reactivity, find that their thoughts become harder to control, their focus weaker, their ability to withstand adversity diminished. If the mind is a muscle, then what strengthens it? The Stoics would argue that mental exercise comes in many forms. Self-reflection, the practice of questioning one's own thoughts and emotions, is one of the most powerful tools for mental discipline. Exposure to challenge, whether through learning, philosophical debate, or deliberate discomfort, forces the mind to expand beyond its limitations. Mindfulness, the ability to observe thoughts without immediately acting on them, builds emotional resilience and clarity. And above all, action, applying knowledge, making decisions based on reason rather than impulse, ensures that wisdom is not merely theoretical, but lived. Marcus Aurelius trained his mind through daily writing, sharpening his awareness of thought patterns. Seneca embraced intellectual challenge, ensuring that comfort did not weaken his reasoning. Epictetus believed that self-discipline was the path to true freedom, teaching that without control over one's own mind, no external freedom truly matters. The lesson is simple: the brain, like the body, must be exercised. Without effort, it atrophies. Without resistance, it weakens. The mind you live with tomorrow is shaped by how you train it today. Your mind absorbs everything. Be selective. The mind is not a fortress, it is a sponge. It absorbs whatever it is exposed to: conversations, media, opinions, emotions, and without awareness, these influences shape the way you think, react, and perceive the world. Most people do not consciously choose their mental diet. They consume passively, allowing their environment to dictate their thoughts. But just as the body is shaped by what it eats, the mind is shaped by what it consistently absorbs. If you do not guard what enters your mind, someone else will decide it for you. Marcus Aurelius was deeply aware of this. He wrote to himself as a reminder to be careful about what he allowed to influence his thinking. He saw how easily the mind is swayed by external forces, social expectations, the moods of others, fleeting emotions. He reminded himself that just because an idea was popular did not make it true, and just because an opinion was loud didn't make it wise. His practice was simple yet powerful, filtering what he engaged with, ensuring that his thoughts were guided by reason rather than by the noise of the world around him. Seneca, observing the distractions of Roman society, saw how people unconsciously adopt the values and anxieties of those they surround themselves with. He noted that many opinions are inherited rather than examined, absorbed rather than chosen. He warned that if one is not careful, they will spend their life chasing ambitions that were never truly their own, worrying about things that do not matter, and adopting fears that were planted in them by others. Seneca did not advocate isolation, but he believed in intentional exposure, choosing what to engage with rather than letting the world dictate one's concerns. Epictetus, whose teachings centered around self-mastery, saw that the most dangerous form of influence is the kind that goes unnoticed. He taught that what we listen to, what we read, and who we associate with are not trivial matters. They shape the way we see ourselves and the world. He encouraged his students to be mindful of their mental environment, to step back and ask, "Are my thoughts truly mine, or have they been given to me?" To him, true independence was not just freedom from external control, but freedom from unconscious influence. This lesson is more relevant today than ever before. The modern world bombards the mind with constant information. News cycles designed to provoke outrage, social media engineered for addiction, endless opinions that demand immediate reactions. Without careful filtering, the brain becomes overstimulated, distracted, and reactive. People wonder why they feel anxious, unfocused, or discontent, yet rarely consider how much mental clutter they allow in each day. But just as the Stoics practiced filtering their influences, so can we. Being selective does not mean avoiding all information. It means choosing what deserves attention. What conversations are worth engaging in? What media strengthens understanding rather than feeds distraction? What environments cultivate clarity rather than confusion? The goal is not ignorance, but discernment. Marcus Aurelius controlled his mental input by questioning every thought before accepting it. Seneca ensured that his priorities remained his own, rather than dictated by society. Epictetus believed that true mastery begins with what we allow into our minds. The mind, left unguarded, will absorb anything. The question is not whether you are being influenced. The question is whether you are choosing that influence or merely accepting whatever happens to enter. Anxiety is a bad fortune teller. Don't believe it. The mind is an expert at predicting disaster. It crafts worst-case scenarios, convinces you that failure is inevitable, and magnifies uncertainty until it feels like an impending crisis. But anxiety is not intuition. It is an unreliable narrator, one that overestimates risk and underestimates your ability to adapt. If left unchecked, it can dictate choices, paralyze action, and create suffering over events that may never even happen. The irony is that most of what people worry about never comes to pass, yet the emotional weight of those imagined fears is carried as if they were already real. Marcus Aurelius wrestled with this reality, reminding himself in his writings that most fears are creations of the mind rather than reflections of the world. He observed how the brain amplifies concerns, turning minor uncertainties into overwhelming threats. His approach was not to deny anxiety, but to question it. Is this fear based on evidence, or is it just my mind preparing for the worst? He saw that many problems exist more in thought than in reality, and that by engaging with them rationally, their power diminishes. Seneca went even further, warning that worrying about the future is like suffering twice, once in the imagination and once, potentially, in reality. He saw anxiety as a misuse of mental energy, a way of living through hardships that have not yet occurred, and in many cases, never will. He believed that fear is often based on incomplete information, assumptions that have not been challenged, and an emotional response that has not been tested against reason. His advice was simple but powerful. Do not allow your mind to torment you with what has not happened. Epictetus, ever focused on what is within one's control, saw that anxiety arises when people fixate on the uncontrollable. He taught that peace comes not from eliminating uncertainty, but from accepting it. He observed that those who spend their days anticipating disaster often overlook their own resilience. What if everything goes wrong? Is the question anxiety asks. But Epictetus would counter with another. And what if you handle it? He knew that people underestimate their ability to adapt, forgetting that they have faced challenges before and survived them. Anxiety convinces you that the unknown is terrifying, but in reality, most obstacles are met with strength that only appears in the moment of necessity. Modern psychology echoes what the Stoics taught centuries ago. Research shows that anxiety is often a cognitive distortion, an exaggeration of risk, a tendency to mistake feelings for facts. The brain, wired for survival, is prone to overreacting to uncertainty, treating discomfort as danger, assuming that an imagined outcome is a likely one. But awareness of this mechanism is the first step in breaking its hold. Just because the mind presents a fear does not mean it must be obeyed. Just because something could happen does not mean it will. The Stoics practiced a technique that is still useful today, preparing for adversity without living in fear of it. Marcus Aurelius would mentally rehearse challenges, not to dwell on them, but to ensure that if difficulties arose, he would not be caught off guard. Seneca advised practicing voluntary discomfort, temporarily exposing oneself to inconvenience to remind the mind that hardship is often far less threatening than it appears from a distance. Epictetus saw that freedom comes when one stops clinging to the illusion of control over the future and instead directs energy toward the present. Anxiety feeds on passivity. When left unchallenged, it grows, filling the spaces where confidence should be. But those who learn to question their fears, to recognize that the mind often fabricates threats, begin to reclaim control. The real danger is not uncertainty itself, but the way one reacts to it. Anxiety will always whisper its warnings, but it does not have to dictate action. The future remains unknown, but one thing is certain: most of what the mind fears will never happen. And for what does, the strength to face it is already within you. You are not your thoughts. Detach and observe. The mind is a constant stream of thoughts, some rational, some irrational, some fleeting, some persistent. But the greatest mistake people make is believing that they are their thoughts, that every worry, every doubt, every passing fear is a reflection of who they truly are. Yet, just as clouds drift across the sky without altering its vastness, thoughts pass through the mind without defining the person experiencing them. The moment you realize this, you take a step toward true mental freedom. Most people live trapped inside their own thoughts, reacting emotionally to everything that arises in their mind. A self-doubt appears, and they accept it as truth. I'm not capable. A fear surfaces, and they assume it's a warning. This will go wrong. A painful memory resurfaces, and they relive it as if it were happening again. But thoughts are not reality. They are simply mental activity, influenced by past experiences, conditioning, and external inputs. Learning to observe thoughts rather than be consumed by them is one of the most powerful shifts a person can make. Marcus Aurelius trained himself in this practice, writing reminders to detach from his thoughts, to see them as separate from his identity. He understood that the mind can be chaotic, that it generates narratives that do not always serve truth or clarity. Instead of reacting immediately, he practiced stepping back, questioning whether a thought was useful or simply noise. He reminded himself that he was the master of his mind, not its prisoner. Seneca, too, saw the danger of unquestioned thoughts. He observed how easily people become entangled in emotions fueled by their own mental stories, resenting someone based on assumptions, fearing an outcome that may never occur, dwelling on past mistakes that no longer hold power. He advised treating thoughts with skepticism, testing them as one would test an unreliable messenger. Just because a thought appears does not mean it is accurate or worth entertaining. Seneca believed that true wisdom comes not from thinking less, but from thinking with awareness. Epictetus, who experienced the harsh realities of life from a young age, understood this concept in its most practical form. He taught that suffering is not caused by events, but by the judgments we attach to them. If one can observe thoughts without immediately accepting them, they gain a level of control that few ever achieve. He encouraged his students to practice what we now call cognitive distancing, recognizing that thoughts are separate from identity. You are not your thoughts. You are the one watching them. Modern psychology aligns with this philosophy, recognizing that thoughts, when left unexamined, can create unnecessary stress, anxiety, and emotional turbulence. Practices such as mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy emphasize the same principle: observe thoughts, challenge their validity, and choose how to respond rather than allowing automatic patterns to dictate emotions and behavior. The ability to step back from mental chatter, to recognize that just because the mind presents an idea does not mean it must be believed, is a fundamental skill in emotional resilience. In everyday life, this distinction is critical. If every doubt is taken as truth, confidence crumbles. If every fear is obeyed, progress halts. If every negative thought is entertained, self-perception becomes distorted. The key is not to suppress thoughts, but to see them for what they are: temporary, shifting, often unreliable. A passing cloud does not change the sky, and a passing thought does not change who you are. Marcus Aurelius disciplined his mind by reminding himself that thoughts are not commands. Seneca practiced skepticism toward his own emotions, ensuring that they were rooted in reason rather than assumption. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when one learns to separate themselves from their thoughts. The lesson is clear: you are not the voice in your head. You are the one listening. And the moment you realize this, you gain a power that most people never discover. Dominate your mind, or it will dominate you. The mind is either your greatest tool or your greatest enemy. It can be a source of strength, clarity, and resilience, or it can work against you, filling your days with doubt, fear, and hesitation. Those who fail to take control of their thoughts do not live by intention, they live by reaction. They are pulled by impulses, overwhelmed by emotions, and dictated by fears they never chose to question. The difference between those who lead their own lives and those who are carried by circumstance is not luck, intelligence, or opportunity. It is mental discipline. Either you master your mind, or your mind masters you. Most people assume that their thoughts are automatic, that emotions must be obeyed, that mental habits cannot be changed. But the truth is, just as the body can be strengthened through discipline, so too can the mind. Marcus Aurelius trained himself daily to maintain control over his internal world, writing reminders that external events hold no power unless the mind grants them influence. He understood that challenges are inevitable, but suffering is often self-imposed, created by a mind that clings to negativity, resists change, and dwells on what cannot be altered. His solution was simple yet profound: observe thoughts before believing them, manage emotions before acting on them, and maintain control over perception, for it dictates reality. Seneca took this further, warning that an undisciplined mind leads to a chaotic life. He saw how people waste their days consumed by distractions, enslaved to desires they never examined, controlled by frustrations that serve no purpose. He believed that mental freedom is the highest form of power, the ability to remain calm in adversity, focused amidst chaos, and deliberate in action rather than reactive in impulse. He viewed every challenge as a test, every hardship as an opportunity to strengthen the mind's ability to remain in control. To him, self-mastery was not just a philosophical ideal, but a necessary skill for anyone seeking a meaningful and composed life. Epictetus, whose early life was marked by external hardship, understood better than anyone that true power does not come from controlling the outside world, but from mastering one's own thoughts. He saw that those who lack control over their minds are prisoners, not of fate, but of their own unchecked emotions and assumptions. He taught that every day presents a choice: to let the mind run wild with fear and doubt, or to direct it with intention and clarity. His philosophy was direct: if you do not take responsibility for your own thoughts, someone else will shape them for you. This principle applies to every area of life. Those who fail to control their minds are controlled by stress, by circumstances, by the opinions of others. They react rather than respond, live in cycles of anxiety rather than in states of focus, and allow their emotions to dictate their choices rather than using reason to guide them. But those who develop discipline over their thoughts gain an unshakable advantage. They do not waste energy on what they cannot control. They do not allow temporary emotions to dictate long-term decisions. They shape their mindset deliberately, ensuring that their internal world serves them rather than enslaves them. Mastery of the mind is not achieved in a single moment. It is a lifelong practice. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to remain steady in the face of turmoil. Seneca reminded himself that the mind, if left unchecked, will lead to unnecessary suffering. Epictetus saw that freedom begins within, and that self-discipline is the foundation of a powerful life. The lesson is clear. Either you rule your thoughts, or they will rule you. The mind will always be at work, shaping your perception, influencing your decisions, determining your reality. The question is, who is in control? You, or the voice in your head? The battle for control is not fought in the outside world. It happens in your own mind. Every day, thoughts arise, emotions surge, and impulses pull you in different directions. If left unexamined, these forces dictate your decisions, shaping your reality without your consent. But those who understand this, who train themselves to observe rather than obey every passing thought, gain something rare: true mental freedom. Marcus Aurelius knew that the mind, when disciplined, becomes a source of resilience, clarity, and strength. Seneca saw that unchecked thoughts are the root of unnecessary suffering, and that those who do not master their thinking become prisoners of their own minds. Epictetus taught that external events are beyond our control, but our interpretation of them is entirely within our grasp. Their message was not about suppressing emotion, nor was it about denying reality. It was about learning to engage with the world through reason rather than reaction. Most people do not take control of their thoughts. They assume that how they feel is an accurate reflection of reality, that their doubts must be obeyed, that their fears are warnings rather than illusions. But the truth is, the mind is not always on your side. It needs to be trained, refined, shaped with intention. Those who master their minds do not eliminate struggle, but they learn to navigate it without being consumed by it. The question is not whether your mind will influence your life. It will. The real question is whether you will be the one directing it, or whether you will be directed by it. The power is already within you, waiting to be claimed. The choice, as always, is yours.